Good evening. Okay, this is the second in our series. And tonight I'm going to be speaking about Eleanor Roosevelt. And then the next 2 weeks, Reverend Albert will be making presentations. I know one will be on Mother Teresa. I'm not sure who the other one is on yet. Mother Teresa, but I'm not sure who his other choice was. But he'll let you know. Okay. So, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, born October 11th, 1884, in Manhattan, New York City. To socialites, Anna Rebecca Hall and Elliot Roosevelt. From an early age, she preferred to be called by her middle name, Eleanor. Though through her father, she was a niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. So her mother nicknamed her Granny because she acted in such a serious manner as a child. But apparently her mother emotionally rejected Eleanor and was also somewhat ashamed of her daughter's alleged plainness. As you might see, I think that's when she was 2 or 3. On May 19th, 1887, when she was 2, she was on board the SS Britannia, I believe it is, with her father and mother when it collided with the SS Celtic. She was lowered into a lifeboat, and she and her parents were taken to the Celtic and then returned to New York. After this traumatic event, she was always afraid of ships and the sea for the rest of her life. Her mother died of diphtheria on December 7th, 1892. She was only 8. And her brother Elliot Jr. died of the same disease the following May. Her father was an alcoholic, confined to a sanatorium. He died August 14th, 1894, after jumping from a window during a fit of delirium tremens. He survived the fall but died from a seizure. So you can see, as a very young girl, she's gone through some very traumatic events. Her brother, whose name, and these are aristocratic names, Gracie Hall. I don't think you know of any males that are called Gracie anymore, but anyway, he also suffered from alcoholism. So there must have been a gene in there somewhere that, in any case, before her father died, he implored her to act as a mother towards Gracie. And it was a request she made good upon for the rest of his life. He died in 1941, so she sort of looked after him. But her childhood losses, and this shouldn't surprise you, left her prone to depression throughout her life. She would have bouts of depression. After the deaths of her parents, she was raised in the household of her maternal grandmother, Mary Livingston Ludlow Hall. As a child, she was insecure and starved for affection and considered herself the ugly duckling. However, at age 14, she wrote that one's prospects in life were not totally dependent on physical beauty. This is what she wrote in her diary. No matter how plain a woman may be, if truth and loyalty are stamped upon her face, all will be attracted to her. She was tutored privately and with the encouragement of her aunt. Well, there she is at 14. was sent to a place called Allensword Academy at the age of 15. It was a private school in Wimbledon, London. Most of you know Wimbledon from the tennis, where she was educated from 1899 to 1902. The head mistress, Marie Souvestre, was a noted educator who sought to cultivate independent thinking in young women. That was her goal. And they became very close. In fact, they maintained correspondence together all the way till 1905 when Souvestre died. And afterwards, Eleanor always had her portrait on her desk. So shows you how influential teachers can be. When she got back to New York, she was presented at a debutante ball, which, of course, this was very much part of the aristocratic lifestyle, at the Waldorf Astoria. There she is. She said of her debut, "It was simply awful." She became active in the New York Junior League, teaching dancing and calisthenics on the East Side slums. So from very early on, she had this call to help uplift those who were disadvantaged. And the organization had been brought to her attention by her good friend and organizer, Mary Harriman, with whom she kept a close relationship. Some say very close. She was a lifelong Episcopalian, regularly attended church services, was very familiar with the Bible, and I'll say more about this right at the end of the presentation. So in the summer of 1902, Eleanor encountered her father's fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on a train to Tivoli, New York. So they met on a train. They began a secret correspondence that sort of developed into a romance and became engaged on November 22nd, 1903. Franklin's mother, Sarah Ann Delano, opposed the union. She was very much opposed and made him promise the engagement would not be officially announced for over a year. From what I gather, she was a fairly domineering woman. Very, yes. She actually took Franklin on a Caribbean cruise. Why? Hoping that a separation would squelch the romance, but Franklin remained determined, and the couple were married March 17, 1905. Theodore Roosevelt's attendance at the ceremony was front page news in the New York Times and other newspapers. That summer, they went on their honeymoon, a 3-month tour of Europe. My honeymoon was one night to Big Bear. Anyway, returning to the U.S., they settled in New York City in a house provided by Franklin's mother, as well as in a second residence at the family's estate overlooking the Hudson River in Hyde Park. From the beginning, Eleanor had, to say the least, a contentious relationship with her controlling mother-in-law. The townhouse that Sarah gave to them was connected to her own residence by sliding doors. And Sarah ran both households in the decade after the marriage. Early on, Eleanor had a breakdown, after which she explained to Franklin, "I did not like to live in a house which was not in any way mine, one that I knew nothing about, and which did not represent the way I wanted to live. That didn't change anything. They would have 6 children over time, and here we see photographs of Anna and James. I couldn't find the others. But if I go to, what's that chat? Yeah, I'll be able to find something. Okay, now this is interesting and I think important. She didn't like having sex with Franklin. She was very open about it. She once told her daughter Anna it was an ordeal that had to be borne. She also considered herself ill-suited to motherhood. Later writing, "It did not come naturally to me to understand little children or enjoy them." And perhaps for this reason, as well as others, Sarah sought to control the raising of her grandchildren. In this regard, Eleanor later reflected, "Franklin's children were more my mother-in-law's children than mine." Her eldest son, James, remembered Sarah telling her grandchildren, "Your mother only bore you. I am more your mother than your mother is." Well, she didn't like her.
Eleanor sure didn't have much of an example.
No, I mean, it's amazing when you think of growing up, first the early traumas, and now these sorts of, I'm surprised she wasn't in a sanatorium, to be quite honest. But she had a strong will. She always had a strong will. So, initially Franklin practiced law. He was a lawyer. But in 1910, he ran for a Senate seat in New York and surprisingly won and became Senator Roosevelt. As senator, he supported New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson's successful bid for the 1912 Democratic nomination for president, of course, Wilson then won. As a result, Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, an office which he held from 1913 to 1919. Now, on September 1918, Eleanor was unpacking one of Franklin's suitcases when she discovered love letters to him from her social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Franklin had been contemplating leaving Eleanor for Mercer. Their relationship right from the beginning was kind of rocky for a variety of reasons. However, following pressure from both his political advisor and his mother, who threatened to disinherit him if he followed through with a divorce, the couple remained married. Now, why would she be opposed to that? That's just bad image, right? We don't get divorced. No. Yeah. And so from that point on, their union was really more of a political partnership. I think it's quite fair to say that. They weren't having sex. They lived in separate apartments, etc. But they got on quite well politically. So disillusioned, Eleanor became active in public life. And this is one way she really got through her depressive periods. Action, working, doing things, serving. And she focused increasingly on her social work rather than her role as a wife. In the 1920 presidential election, Franklin was nominated as a running mate. These are some good little facts for Jeopardy, by the way. For the candidate of the party was one James M. Cox, who I'm sure you all know a lot about. Yeah. Eleanor joined Franklin, touring the country and making her first campaign appearances. However, Cox was defeated by the Republican Warren G. Harding. Next major event took place in August of 1921. The family was vacationing at Campobello Island, New Brunswick, when Franklin had been swimming, came in, didn't feel well, eventually was diagnosed with paralytic illness at the time believed to be polio. And for the rest of his life, he would have to have help walking. So he was a cripple. You often don't know this, or people wouldn't know this. Why? He was never pictured. He always had his pictures taken when he was sitting behind a desk or in a car.
And he always made arrangements to do that in advance.
Right.
Before anybody got there, before the photographer came.
I think it's interesting that the photographers and the news people were willing.
At that time, yes. Now, you can imagine today if you tried to get it.
The paparazzi.
Yeah, the paparazzi. The other thing about a car, he had it designed so he could drive it with his hand. He didn't have to use his...
And we saw his car at the museum in New York. And it's a great place to visit, really. His last car was a 36 Ford. And of course, he had money. This is all custom done, but it had a little lever on the dash, the accelerator, had one lever for the clutch, another one for the foot brake, and then it had a brake, emergency brake, hand brake. It was a standard transmission. When he shifted it, he had to put his knees on the steering wheel, pull up the clutch, and then shift, and then let the clutch in. It was one hand back on the steering wheel, and then the other one back on the accelerator.
So during the illness, she nursed him and probably saved his life. She was very, very much involved in taking care of him. His legs remained permanently paralyzed. When the extent of the disability became clear, Eleanor fought a protracted battle with her mother-in-law over his future, persuading him to stay in politics, despite Sarah's urging that he retire and become a country gentleman. Franklin's attending physician, this gentleman, Dr. William Keene, commended her devotion to the stricken Franklin during the time of travail. He said, "You have been a rare wife and have borne your heavy burden most bravely. You are one of my heroines." She began serving as a stand-in for her incapacitated husband, making public appearances on his behalf. She also started working with the Women's Trade Union League, raising funds in support of the union's goals: a 48-hour work week, minimum wage, and the abolition of child labor. So throughout the 20s, she increasingly became more influential as a leader in the New York State Democratic Party. Franklin used her contacts among Democratic women to strengthen his standing and winning their committed support for the future. Tensions between, you should be able to tell me now, Sarah and Eleanor over her new political friends, who tended to be on the left, rose to the point that the family constructed a cottage in which Eleanor and her guests lived when Franklin was away. She named the place Valkill, which I guess loosely translated as Waterfall Stream. Here she implemented some of her ideas for work with winter jobs for rural workers and women. So in 1924, she campaigned for the Democrat Alfred E. Smith in his successful re-election bid as governor of New York State. Against the Republican nominee, her first cousin, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Theodore Jr. never forgave her. So in 1927, she joined friends Marion Dickerman and Nancy Cook in buying the Todhunter School for Girls in New York City, a finishing school which also offered college preparatory classes. You know what finishing schools are? Those were schools where girls were sent to finish them, get them ready for their social life. Eleanor actually taught at the school. She taught courses in American literature and American history. And during her teaching, she always emphasized independent thought and social engagement. So in 1929, Franklin was elected governor of New York. And she continued to teach 3 days a week at the school. We don't have to go into the whole history as his governor, but you can see he's going up the ladder, right? What's the next step? President, which she ran for and was elected, and she became First Lady March 4th, 1933. This was a picture of them together just before the election. Having known all of the 20th century's previous first ladies, she studied them. She had always felt that the first ladies had been too restricted in their roles, which were basically domestic and sort of hostessing parties, etc. Her immediate predecessor in the White House, anyone know who this was? Lou Henry Hoover, had ended her feminist, she was a pretty active feminist at the time, but she ended it on becoming First Lady, stating her intention to be only a backdrop for Bertie. Bertie was Hoover's nickname. Eleanor, however, set out to redefine the position. And according to her biographer, Blanche Wiesen Cook, in the process, she became, quote, the most controversial First Lady in United States history. Despite criticism, and I must add, with Franklin's strong support, she continued with the active speaking agenda she had begun before assuming the role. She was the first president's spouse to hold a regular press conference and the first to speak at a national party convention. She wrote a daily and widely syndicated newspaper column, My Day, another first for a presidential spouse. She was also the first lady to write a monthly magazine column and host a weekly radio show. So in the first year of her husband's administration, she earned $75,000, which was a lot of money at that time, from her lectures and writing. Most of it she gave to charity. So in early 1933, this is interesting. Whoops, going backwards. The Bonus Army protest took place. This was a group of World War I vets. They marched on Washington for the second time in 2 years, calling for their veteran bonus certificates to be awarded early. The previous year, President Hoover had ordered them dispersed by sending in the U.S. Army cavalry, which charged them and bombarded the veterans with tear gas. But this time they come back, and Eleanor visited the veterans at their muddy campsite, listened to their concerns, and sang Army songs with them. The meeting diffused the tension between the veterans and the administration, and one of the marchers later commented, "Hoover sent the Army. President Roosevelt sent his wife." One of her chief projects during her husband's first 2 terms was the establishment of a planned community in West Virginia known as Arthurdale. On August 18, 1933, she had visited the families of homeless miners in West Virginia who had been blacklisted because they had followed Union activities. She was deeply affected by the visit and proposed a resettlement community for the miners at Arthurdale, where they could make a living by subsistence farming, handicrafts, and a local manufacturing plant. She hoped the project would become a model for the new kind of community in the United States in which workers would be better cared for. Franklin enthusiastically supported the project. One of the advantages, you see, he didn't have to come out and do this openly. If she could do it and he would support it, politically, I guess that made a little more sense. So after an initial disastrous experiment with prefab housing, construction finally began in 1934 with every modern convenience, including indoor plumbing. Now, how many of you consider that a modern convenience? And central steam heat. Families occupied the first 50 homes in June and agreed to repay the government in 30 years' time. It was like a 30-year mortgage. Though she had hoped for a racially mixed community, the miners, West Virginia miners, insisted on limiting membership only to white Christians. Got to remember the time now. Well, I guess. So after losing a community vote, she voted against that. She recommended the creation of other communities for black and Jewish miners. So she wanted to have separate but equal, I guess, at that time. And it really motivated her to become much more outspoken on issues of racial discrimination, which we'll see some of the things she did in a few moments. For several years, she remained a vigorous fundraiser for the community, as well as spending most of her income on the project. So she put a lot of her own income into it. However, the project was criticized both by the political left and the political right. That's never good. Criticized by one side, well, maybe you, okay, but when it's, okay, conservatives condemned it as a socialist, perhaps communist plot, while Democratic members of Congress opposed government competition with private enterprise. Arthurdale thus continued to sink as a spending priority for the federal government until 1941, when the U.S. sold off the last of its holdings in the community. But sort of visionary, you know, in terms of looking at housing problems, you know, starting this new community.
Public housing.
Yeah, public housing. So getting back to civil rights, Eleanor is generally seen by historians as having been significantly more advanced than her husband on civil rights and racial rights. During his administration, she became an important connection to the African American population. So she had good connections with women and connections with the African American community. Despite the president's desire to placate Southern sentiment, that's the political game. Remember what time we're talking about now. Eleanor was vocal in her support of the civil rights movement early on. This is before the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. In this regard, she concluded that the president's New Deal programs, his New Deal as part of the Depression, were discriminating against African Americans who received a disproportionately small share of relief money. So she spoke out against this. She became one of the only voices in her husband's administration insisting that benefits be equally extended to Americans of all races. She broke with a long-standing tradition by inviting hundreds of African American guests to the White House. In 1936, she became aware of conditions at the National Training School for Girls, a predominantly black reform school, once located in Palisades neighborhood of Washington, D.C. She visited the school, wrote about it in her My Day column, lobbied for additional funding, and pressed for changes in both staffing and curriculum. Her White House invitation to the students became an issue in Franklin's 36 re-election campaign. In 1939, you remember this lady? One of the great voices. She was denied the use of Washington's Constitutional Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Eleanor, as a result, resigned from the group in protest and helped arrange another concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. As it might be expected, her support of African American rights made her an unpopular figure, to say the least, among whites in the South. Rumors spread of what they called Eleanor clubs, formed by African American servants to oppose their employers. So this was a conspiracy theory. She was encouraging servants, that's the maids and butlers, etc., to go against their employer. There's no evidence ever found about that, but you know how rumors can start and rumors can spread. In any case, so this was something she had to deal with. And when race riots broke out in 1943 in Detroit, critics wrote that Eleanor was to blame. At the same time, she grew so popular among African Americans that they became a consistent base of support for the Democratic Party. She was an unprecedentedly outspoken First Lady who made far more use of the media than her predecessors. She held 348 press conferences over the span of her husband's presidency. And she placed a ban on male reporters attending the press conferences. Well, they were attending, where women couldn't. Effectively forcing newspapers to keep female reporters on staff in order to cover them. In the early days of her all-female press conferences, she said the conferences would not address politics, legislation, or executive decision, since the role of the First Lady was expected to be non-political. But the conferences did provide an opportunity for women reporters to speak directly with the First Lady. And that had been unavailable in earlier administrations. No access to the First Lady. Because the Gridiron Club, what do you think the Gridiron Club was about? Football, oh, good guess. Banned women from its annual dinner. She hosted a competing event for female reporters at the White House, which she called Gridiron Widows. She was interviewed by numerous newspapers. This New Orleans journalist Iris Kelso described Eleanor as her most interesting interviewee ever. On entering the White House, she signed a contract with this magazine, Woman's Home Companion, to provide a monthly column in which she answered mail sent to her by readers. She continued her articles in other venues, publishing over 60 articles in national magazines during her tenure as First Lady. She also began, I mentioned this earlier, the syndicated newspaper column My Day, which appeared 6 days a week from 1936 till her death in 1962. Here she wrote about her daily activities, but also humanitarian concerns. And from 1941 until her death in 62, she also wrote an advice column, If You Ask Me, first published in Ladies' Home Journal and later in McCall's. She also made extensive use of the radio. She was not the first lady to broadcast. That had actually been done by Lou Henry Hoover. But Hoover did not have a regular program, whereas Eleanor had a regular program. She first broadcast programs of radio commentary beginning July 9th, 1934. On that first show, she talked about the effect of movies on children. The need for a censor who could make sure movies did not glorify crime and violence. And her opinion about the recent All-Star baseball game. She said she would not accept any salary for being on air and that she would donate the amount to charity. Later that year, in November of 1934, she broadcast a series of programs about children's education. She once again donated the money, giving it to the American Friends Service Committee to help with a school it had opened. She also spoke as a guest on numerous other programs. And in 1935, she continued to host programs aimed at a female audience, including one called It's a Woman's World. Each time she donated the money she earned to charity. She continued to broadcast throughout the 30s on CBS and NBC. At the beginning of World War II, as the U.S. began to move towards a war footing, she found herself experiencing another depression. Part of it has been said that she feared her role in fighting for domestic justice would be put completely aside now. And everything would be focused on foreign affairs. She soon found wartime causes to work on, beginning with a movement to allow the immigration of European refugee children. She also lobbied her husband to allow greater immigration of groups persecuted by the Nazis, including Jews. But fears of what were known as fifth columnists, you know what a fifth columnist is? That's someone who infiltrates. Okay? Caused Franklin to restrict immigration rather than expanding it. She did, however, successfully secure political refugee rights for 83 Jewish refugees on the SS Kwanzaa in August of 1940. But other requests were refused. Her son James later wrote, her deepest regret at the end of her life was that she had not forced Franklin to accept more refugees from Nazism during the war. Then following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, she spoke out against Japanese-American prejudice, warning against the, quote, the great hysteria against minority groups. She privately opposed her husband's Executive Order 9066, which required Japanese Americans to enter internment camps. It had to be done privately. That was just, to do that publicly would have just not been acceptable to Franklin. But anyway, she had always expressed that she'd been opposed to this. Still, she was widely criticized for her defense of Japanese American citizens, including a call by the good old Los Angeles Times that she be, quote, forced to retire from public life over her position. But she was active on the home front beginning in 1941. She co-chaired the Office of Civilian Defense with New York City Mayor LaGuardia, working to give civilian volunteers expanded roles in war preparations. Also in 1941, there was a short film, Women in Defense. She wrote it. It was directed by John Ford and produced by the Office of Emergency Management. It briefly outlined the way in which women could help prepare the country for the possibility of war. World War II was really a turning point in the women's movement, because this was the first time that women really got into the workforce and were needed. Before that, it was mainly depending on your class, of course, stay-at-home moms, but during the war, women had to work. And this was a big movement a big move forward for women. So in 1942, she toured England, that she didn't like to see, visiting the American troops and inspecting British forces. Her visits drew enormous crowds, received favorable press in both England and America. And in August of 43, she visited American troops in the South Pacific on a morale-building tour, of which Admiral William Halsey Jr. later said, she alone accomplished more good than any other person or any groups of civilians who had passed through my area. Franklin died April 12, 1945. Suffering a cerebral hemorrhage at what was known as the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia. Eleanor later learned that Lucy Mercer had been with him when he died. Franklin left instructions for her in the event of his death. He proposed turning over Hyde Park to the federal government as a museum, and she spent the following months cataloging the estate and arranging for transfer. So the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum opened April 12, 1946, setting a precedent for future presidential libraries. This was the first presidential library. In December of 45, President Truman appointed her as a delegate to the United Nations General Assembly. In 1946, she became the first chairperson of the preliminary United Nations Commission on Human Rights. She remained chairperson when the commission was established on a permanent basis in January 47, and she played an instrumental role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a speech on the night of September 28, 1948, she spoke in favor of the Declaration, calling it the International Magna Carta of all men everywhere. And the Declaration was adopted by the General Assembly December 10th, 1948. That year, she was on the cover, Times Magazine's 100 Women of the Year, a list the most influential women of the past century. So throughout the 50s, she embarked on countless national and international speaking engagements. She continued to pen her newspaper column, made appearances on television, radio broadcasts. She averaged 150 lectures a year throughout the 50s, many devoted to her activism on behalf of the UN. She was widely known for her anti-colonial stance. For example, she supported Moroccan independence through both personal intervention with the US authorities and addressing the Moroccan question in her daily column, My Day. Over the years, she received numerous awards. First annual FDR Brotherhood Award, the Award of Merit to the New York City Federation of Women's Club, and the Prince Carl Medal from Sweden. According to Gallup's Most Admired Man and Woman poll, she was the most admired living woman every year between 1948 and 1961, except one. And if you can name that, you get a free trip to Oxnard. 1951, Sister Elizabeth Kenny, very famous Catholic activist nun. In April of 60, she was diagnosed with aplastic anemia after being struck by a car in New York City. She was given steroids in 1962, which activated a dormant case of tuberculosis in her marrow. And she died November 7th, 1962, at her Manhattan home, 55 East 74th Street, age 78, from cardiac failure. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy ordered all United States flags lowered to half-staff throughout the world. Funeral services were held 2 days later in Hyde Park, where she was interred next to her husband in the Rose Garden at the Springwood Estate, the Roosevelt family home. After her death, Eleanor's retreat, the Valkiel, near Hyde Park, was preserved as the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site. The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial on the National Mall in Washington is the only United States presidential memorial to depict a First Lady. That's her statue. Her statue is displayed with a likeness of the United Nations seal. So I want to say a few remarks about her religious beliefs. Dr. Harold Ivan Smith, who wrote a book about this, states that she was very public about her faith. In hundreds of My Day and If You Ask Me columns, she addressed issues of faith, prayer, and the Bible. She had something of an encyclopedic memory of the New Testament, large portions of which she had memorized in French. Her spirituality was anchored by what she called two bookends. First, the Hebrew prophet Micah's question, "What does the Lord require of you?" answer: to love justice, to act mercifully, and walk humbly with one's God. The second was Jesus' declaration: whatever you have done to the least of these, my brethren, you have done unto me. And to Eleanor, it did not require genius to determine who the least of these were in any setting. She also found great meaning in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. This was her spiritual home base, St. James Parish in Hyde Park. She particularly cherished the Eucharist, or communion, because she felt when she knelt at the altar, she was not Mrs. Roosevelt, First Lady, or UN delegate, just another Christian. At midnight Christmas Eve service, this was very important for her. She didn't go to it, however, until she had distributed gifts to needy children in the alleys of Washington's slums. All right, let's close with this quote. About the only value the story of my life may have is to show that one can, even without any particular gifts, overcome obstacles that seem unsurmountable if one is willing to face the fact that they must be overcome. That was Eleanor. Strong will. And again, I look at her background and think just how many people would have just folded. How many people would have folded at that point? Okay, that's it for tonight. Any questions, comments?
I think some of her work, most of her work, was extremely valuable. It had to be put in context, and then it had to be marched out. But she also had the advantage of having money behind her, and she could make choices that others couldn't.
She had the advantage, but what's the thing? To those who are given much, much is required. And she followed that. She followed that. You know, she could have lived the life of an aristocratic socialite, but right from early age, and who knows why these things are the way they are, she was not going to be that way. She was not going to be that way.
But the school in Europe did a great deal.
Yes, yes,
and give her permission
yes,
to do it.
yes, very much. That teacher, and that's why she always kept the picture of that teacher on her desk.
Right.
Yeah. Women can do this. You have to believe that first. You don't believe that, you're not going to do anything. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
How many years after Roosevelt passed did she pass?
Well, let's see. What were the dates? She died, what years did I give you? She died 62, did I say? And he died, what did I say?
45 or
45, so that's 17 years. 17
close to
years.
40 years.
She was and she was active. Yeah, very, very much.
70's not old. She died young.
Yes. And it was brought about by, she was hit by a car,
Yeah.
and then things developed, and then unfortunately she was given this steroid, which, and I don't know the medical aspects of this, but this somehow triggered some dormant tuberculosis, and that's how she died.
That was probably not known at the time.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Could
Yeah.
have been a spur, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. I mean, I hate to see the wealthy go to doctors
Yes. Yeah.
to get things that the rest of us
Oh,
often
definitely.
don't get.
Yeah. Definitely.
It actually impairs your immune system,
The
and that's the rest.
okay.
The steroid was just kind of coming out, wasn't it? It was looked at as a cure-all. I mean, it helped arthritis, all kinds of things that we later learned were not good methods.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming.
What's next week?
Next week is Albert, And I know he's doing Mother Teresa as one of his women. I'm not sure who the second one is, because I emailed him, but he was too busy. Well, anyway, so but whoever it is, I'm sure it'll be interesting. And then then I'll come back week 5 with Malala, the Pakistani young lady who won the Nobel Peace Prize.